My son said, "You're too old to live alone, Mom," while standing in my living room planning to take my house. I'm 68 years old, sharp as a tack, and I was about to show him just how wrong he was. The afternoon sun streamed through my kitchen windows as I watched my daughter-in-law Brenda arrange fresh lilies in my grandmother's crystal vase. Her movements were deliberate, calculated, like everything else she did in my house these days. It had been 3 weeks since my heart attack, and suddenly everyone was very concerned about my well-being. "Dorothy, you just rest and let us handle everything," Brenda said without looking up from the flowers. "You've been through enough stress lately." My name is Dorothy Parker, and at 68 years old, I never imagined that surviving a heart attack would become the least of my problems. After 40 years of teaching high school English and raising my son Stephen as a single mother, I thought I'd earned the right to live peacefully in the home I'd worked so hard to buy. But as I watched Brenda rearrange my furniture and reorganize my kitchen cabinets with the efficiency of someone who planned to be here permanently, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my family dynamics. The heart attack had been sudden and terrifying. One moment I was grading papers at my kitchen table. The next I was waking up in the cardiac unit with Stephen holding my hand and tears in his eyes. The doctor said I was lucky. Minimal damage, excellent prognosis, just needed to take things easier and follow up with medications. But ever since I'd come home from the hospital, Stephen and Brenda had been treating me like I was made of glass. They'd moved into my guest room temporarily to help with my recovery, but their presence felt more like an occupation than assistance. "Where's Stephen?" I asked, noticing my son's absence from the usual afternoon routine they'd established. "He's at the bank," Brenda replied, finally looking up from the flowers, "taking care of some paperwork to make sure all your financial matters are in order. You know, just in case." Just in case of what? The question hung in my mind like a warning bell. I was recovering beautifully, according to Dr. Martinez. My energy was returning, my appetite was back, and I'd been cleared to resume normal activities. Within reason. The sound of Stephen's key in the front door interrupted my thoughts. At 42, my son still had the confident stride I remembered from his college football days, though success in his real estate business had added a few pounds and some expensive clothes to his appearance. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, entering the kitchen with that serious expression that had preceded important conversations throughout his childhood. Brenda immediately moved to stand beside him, a unified front that made my stomach clench with unidentified anxiety. Whatever this conversation was about, they'd clearly planned it in advance. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" I asked, though something in his tone already told me I wasn't going to like the answer. Stephen pulled out a chair across from me, his expression mixing concern with determination. "Mom, Brenda and I have been talking, and we're worried about you living alone in this big house." The words hit me like cold water. Living alone? I'd been living alone just fine for the 15 years, since his father died. This house wasn't just where I lived. It was where I'd raised Stephen, where I'd hosted family holidays, where every room held memories of the life I'd built through my own hard work. "I'm recovering well," I said carefully. Dr. Martinez said I could resume normal activities. "That's not the point," Brenda interjected, her voice carrying that patronizing tone she used when she thought she was being helpful. "At your age, living alone after a major cardiac event is simply not safe." At my age, I was 68, not 88. I still drove, still maintained my garden, still helped tutor struggling students from the high school where I'd taught for decades. When had 68 become synonymous with helpless? Stephen leaned forward, reaching for my hand in a gesture that would have seemed loving if it hadn't felt so calculated. "Mom, we've found some really nice assisted living facilities, places where you'd have help available 24/7, social activities with people your own age, and no worries about maintaining this house." The room seemed to tilt slightly as the implications of his words sank in. They weren't suggesting I get some help around the house or install a medical alert system. They were suggesting I abandon my home and move into institutional care. "I don't need assisted living," I said, pulling my hand away from his. "I need to recover from a heart attack, which I'm doing quite successfully." Brenda moved closer, positioning herself where she could make eye contact. "Dorothy, we understand this is difficult to hear, but you have to be realistic about your limitations. What if you have another episode? What if you fall and can't reach the phone? The scenarios she painted were designed to frighten me, to make me doubt my own capabilities. But after 40 years of dealing with teenagers who thought they could manipulate their English teacher, I recognized emotional manipulation when I saw it. "What about this house?" I asked, watching their expressions carefully. Stephen and Brenda exchanged a glance that lasted just a beat too long. "Well, obviously you'd need to sell it to pay for your care," Stephen said. "Brenda and I could handle all the paperwork for you, make sure you get a fair price." There it was, the real motivation behind their sudden concern for my well-being. This house, which I'd bought with my teacher's salary and maintained through decades of careful budgeting, represented a substantial asset. In today's market, it was probably worth close to $400,000. "I see," I said quietly, though I was beginning to see much more than they realized. The pattern was becoming clear now, the frequent visits that had started even before my heart attack. Brenda's detailed questions about my financial planning and estate preparation. Stephen's sudden interest in my insurance policies and investment accounts. They weren't here to help me recover. They were here to position themselves for the inheritance they apparently felt entitled to claim while I was still alive. "We've already visited a few places," Brenda continued, pulling out a glossy brochure from her purse. "Sunset Manor has a beautiful garden, and their activities director is wonderful. You'd love it there." I looked down at the brochure's cheerful photos of elderly people playing bingo and doing crafts. These were fine activities for people who chose them, but they weren't my life. My life was my books, my garden, my weekly coffee dates with former colleagues, my volunteer work at the literacy center. "When exactly did you visit these places?" I asked. Stephen shifted uncomfortably. "Last week while you were napping. We wanted to have options ready so you wouldn't have to stress about researching." "Last week?" "While I was recovering from a heart attack. They'd been touring nursing homes and making plans for my future without consulting me. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd experienced in the hospital." "This is very thoughtful," I said carefully. "But I'm not ready to make such a major decision. I need time to think." "Mom, time isn't really a luxury we have," Stephen pressed. "The good facilities have waiting lists. If we wait too long, you might not have the same options." The urgency was artificial, designed to pressure me into making a decision while I was still vulnerable from my recent health scare. But what they didn't realize was that their manipulation was actually helping me think more clearly than I had in weeks. "I'd like to discuss this with Dr. Martinez before making any commitments," I said firmly. Brenda's smile became more strained. "Of course, but doctors don't always understand the practical realities of aging in place. They focus on medical recovery, not lifestyle safety." The conversation continued for another hour, with Stephen and Brenda presenting their arguments with the persistence of salespeople who smelled a commission. But with each point they made, I became more certain that this wasn't about my safety or well-being. This was about my assets. That evening, after they'd gone to bed in my guest room, I sat in my study surrounded by the financial documents I kept in my home safe. Insurance policies, investment statements, the deed to my house, my will, all the paperwork that represented a lifetime of careful financial planning. I'd made Stephen the beneficiary of everything, naturally. He was my only child, and I'd always assumed he would inherit my estate when I died. But I'd never imagined he might try to accelerate that timeline by convincing me I was too incompetent to manage my own life. The next morning brought a phone call that would change everything. Dr. Martinez's office was calling to schedule my follow-up appointment, and when I mentioned my family's concerns about living alone, the nurse's response was illuminating. "Mrs. Parker, your recovery has been textbook perfect," she said. "Dr. Martinez specifically noted in your file that you're an ideal candidate for aging in place with minimal lifestyle modifications. Has something changed with your condition?" "No, nothing's changed medically," I replied, glancing toward the kitchen where I could hear Stephen and Brenda discussing something in hushed tones. "Well, if you have specific safety concerns, we can refer you to an occupational therapist who specializes in home safety assessments. But based on your current health status, there's no medical reason why you couldn't continue living independently for many years." I thanked the nurse and hung up, armed with professional medical opinion that directly contradicted everything Stephen and Brenda had been telling me. They'd been presenting their position as medical necessity when it was actually personal preference. Their preference for my money. The sound of footsteps in the hallway warned me that my planning time was over. Stephen appeared in the doorway of my study, holding a cup of coffee and wearing the expression of someone preparing for battle. Mom, Brenda and I think we should drive out to Sunset Manor this afternoon. Just to take a look. No pressure. Actually, I called Dr. Martinez's office this morning, I said, watching his reaction carefully. They said there's no medical reason I can't continue living here. Stephen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mom, doctors don't always consider all the factors. They focus on immediate medical needs, not long-term practical concerns. What practical concerns specifically? I asked. Well, what if you have another heart attack? What if you fall in the shower? What if you forget to take your medications? The scenarios were hypothetical, designed to create fear rather than address actual problems. Stephen, I've been taking medications responsibly for decades. I have a shower with grab bars that I installed 2 years ago, and my heart attack was caused by stress, not by my living situation. Brenda joined us, carrying her own coffee mug like a weapon. Dorothy, we're trying to look out for your best interests. Sometimes family members are the last to recognize when it's time to make changes. The condescension in her voice triggered something that had been building for weeks. This woman who had married my son 5 years ago was now presuming to tell me what was in my best interest regarding the house I'd owned for 20 years. Brenda, I appreciate your concern, I said evenly, but I'm quite capable of making decisions about my own life. Are you, though? The question came out sharper than she'd probably intended. Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you're in denial about your limitations. And there it was. The mask slipping to reveal what they really thought of me. Not a woman recovering from a medical event, but an elderly person whose judgment couldn't be trusted. What limitations specifically? I asked. Stephen jumped in before Brenda could answer. Mom, you're 68 years old. You live alone in a 3-bedroom house. You're maintaining a large yard and dealing with all the responsibilities of homeownership. That's a lot for anyone, especially someone who just had a heart attack. I'm 68, not 98, I replied calmly. 68-year-olds are running companies, traveling the world and living independent lives every day. But those people probably have support systems, Brenda said. Family nearby, resources for help when they need it. I have you, I said simply. Or at least I thought I did. The silence that followed was heavy with implications none of us wanted to examine too closely. Finally, Stephen spoke. Mom, we are here for you. That's exactly why we're having this conversation. We want to make sure you're safe and cared for. By putting me in an institution and selling my house? By helping you transition to a lifestyle that matches your current needs, Brenda corrected. It's not about what we want. It's about what's realistic. But I was beginning to understand that their version of realistic involved me giving up my independence and my assets, while they positioned themselves to benefit from both. The afternoon visit to Sunset Manor was everything I'd expected it to be. Clean, cheerful, and soul-crushingly institutional. The activities director showed us the craft room, the library, a few dozen paperback novels, and the dining room where residents sat at assigned tables eating food that reminded me of school cafeterias. And this would be your room, she said, opening the door to a small space with a hospital bed, a single dresser, and a chair positioned by a window that looked out onto the parking lot. I thought about my bedroom at home, with the built-in bookshelves. I'd installed myself, the reading chair where I spent my mornings with coffee and newspapers, the garden view that changed with the seasons. This sterile box was supposed to be an improvement. The monthly fee covers everything, the director continued. Meals, activities, basic medical monitoring, and housekeeping. Your family wouldn't have to worry about anything. What about personal belongings? I asked. You can bring some furniture and personal items within reason. We find that most residents prefer to downsize significantly when they move in. Downsize. From a house full of books I'd collected over a lifetime of teaching, furniture inherited from my parents, artwork I'd bought during travels, and photographs documenting 40 years of raising my son. All of that reduced to whatever would fit, in a room the size of my current walk-in closet. On the drive home, Stephen and Brenda were enthusiastic about what they'd seen. "The staff seems really caring," Brenda said, "and the other residents looked happy." "Did they?" I asked, because what I'd seen were people who looked resigned, comfortable perhaps, but resigned to having their lives managed by others. "Mom, I know it's a big change," Stephen said, "but think about how much stress this would eliminate from your life. No more worrying about maintenance, no more dealing with yard work, no more being alone during an emergency." What he wasn't saying was how much stress it would eliminate from their lives. No more checking on me, no more helping with repairs or emergencies, and access to the substantial equity in my house to fund their own lifestyle upgrades. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my attorney, Eleanor. Patterson had handled my legal affairs for 15 years, ever since she'd helped me update my will after my husband's death. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in elder law and had seen every variation of family financial manipulation. "Dorothy, how are you feeling? I heard about your heart attack." "I'm recovering well, Eleanor, but I need your advice on a family matter." I explained the situation. Stephen and Brenda's sudden insistence that I needed assisted living, their pressure to sell the house, their claims that I was too old to live independently despite my doctor's contrary opinion. Eleanor listened without interruption, asking only a few clarifying questions about timelines and specific statements they'd made. "Dorothy, what you're describing is a fairly common scenario. Adult children who assume their aging parents are unable to make sound decisions, especially when there are significant assets involved." "So you don't think I'm being paranoid?" "Not at all. The fact that they're pushing for immediate action, dismissing your doctor's assessment, and already touring facilities without your knowledge are red flags. How is your house titled currently?" "It's in my name alone." "Good. And your will?" "Stephen inherits everything, but I'm beginning to wonder if that's wise." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Dorothy, before you make any changes to your estate planning, I think we need to establish some protections for your current autonomy. Are you interested in exploring legal options?" "What kind of options?" "Well, if Stephen and Brenda continue to pressure you or try to force decisions about your living situation, we could pursue several strategies. A competency evaluation to officially establish your mental capacity, documentation of any coercive behavior, even a restraining order if necessary. The idea that I might need legal protection from my own son was heartbreaking, but the alternative, losing my home and independence to their manipulation, was worse. What would that involve? First, we'd arrange for an independent psychological evaluation to document your cognitive function. Given your successful career and current circumstances, I expect you'd pass with flying colors. That gives us legal ammunition if anyone tries to claim you're incompetent. And then? Then we wait and document. If they continue to pressure you, or make threats about your living situation, we have grounds for legal action to protect your rights. I spent the weekend thinking about Eleanor's advice while Stephen and Brenda continued their campaign to convince me that institutional care was my only reasonable option. They'd brought more brochures, scheduled additional facility tours, and started making comments about accepting reality and not being stubborn about necessary changes. On Monday morning, I made my decision. "Stephen, Brenda, I need to tell you something important," I said over breakfast. They looked up expectantly, probably hoping I was ready to surrender to their pressure. "I've decided to get a comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation to determine my capacity for independent living." Stephen's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" "I mean that since there seems to be disagreement about my ability to make decisions about my own life, I'm going to get professional assessments to settle the question objectively." Brenda's face went pale. "Dorothy, that's not necessary. We're not questioning your mental capacity." "Aren't you? You've spent 2 weeks telling me I can't be trusted to live alone, can't make sound decisions about my housing, and need other people to manage my life. That sounds like questioning my mental capacity." Stephen set down his fork entirely. "Mom, we're just concerned about your safety." "Then you should be happy to have professional confirmation of my abilities," I replied, calmly. "If I'm truly incompetent to make these decisions, the evaluation will show that. If I'm not, then we can stop having conversations about putting me in a nursing home." The silence that followed was telling. If they genuinely believed I was impaired, they would have welcomed professional assessment. Their obvious discomfort suggested they knew their claims about my incompetence were false. "Who's doing this evaluation?" Brenda asked. "Dr. Rebecca Chen, a neuropsychologist who specializes in cognitive assessment for older adults. Eleanor Patterson referred me to her." Another telling silence. They'd assumed I was too confused or intimidated to seek professional help. The mention of my attorney's name clearly indicated that I was taking this situation more seriously than they'd anticipated. "Mom, involving lawyers seems extreme," Stephen said carefully. "Does it? Because from my perspective, having family members try to force me out of my home and into institutional care against my doctor's advice seems pretty extreme too." Brenda stood up abruptly. "We're trying to help you. Why are you treating us like enemies?" "I'm treating you like people who are trying to make major decisions about my life without my consent," I replied. "If that's not what you're doing, then the evaluation will confirm it and we can move forward with better understanding." Stephen pushed back from the table. "Fine. Get your evaluation, but don't blame us when the results show what we've been trying to tell you." But I could see in his eyes that he was worried about exactly the opposite outcome. Dr. Chen's evaluation took place over 2 sessions in her comfortable office overlooking the city park. For 3 hours, she put me through cognitive tests, memory, assessments, problem-solving exercises, and psychological evaluations designed to measure my capacity for independent living. The process was thorough but not intimidating. After 4 decades of teaching, I was comfortable with testing situations, and my recent retirement meant my mind was sharp and focused rather than stressed by work demands. "Mrs. Parker," Dr. Chen said during our final session, "I want you to know that your test results are excellent. Your cognitive function is well within normal ranges for your age group, and actually above average in several areas." Relief flooded through me, though I'd been confident about the outcome. "So there's no medical reason I shouldn't continue living independently?" "None whatsoever. Your memory, judgment, problem-solving abilities, and executive function are all intact. You show no signs of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity." She paused, studying my file. "Mrs. Parker, may I ask what prompted this evaluation? It's unusual for someone with your obvious capabilities to seek this type of assessment." I explained the situation with Stephen and Brenda, their pressure for me to move to assisted living, their claims that I couldn't safely live alone. Dr. Chen's expression grew concerned. "I see this more often than I'd like. Adult children who assume that any health event means their parents can no longer make sound decisions. Sometimes it's genuine concern, but sometimes it's about money," I finished. "Sometimes it is. The good news is that you now have professional documentation of your competence. If anyone questions your ability to make decisions about your living situation, you have objective evidence to support your position." Armed with Dr. Chen's report and renewed confidence in my position, I returned home to find Stephen and Brenda waiting with more nursing home brochures and what looked like preliminary paperwork. "How did your evaluation go?" Stephen asked, though his tone suggested he was hoping for bad news. "Very well," I replied, setting Dr. Chen's official report on the coffee table. Dr. Chen found no cognitive impairment whatsoever. She said my mental function is actually above average for my age group. I watched the color drain from Brenda's face as she picked up the report and began reading. She also said that there's no medical or psychological reason I shouldn't continue living independently for many years to come. Stephen grabbed the report from Brenda, scanning it quickly. "One doctor's opinion doesn't change the practical realities of your situation?" "Actually, it does," I said calmly, "because that one doctor is a specialist in exactly this type of assessment, and her opinion carries legal weight." The implications hung in the air like storm clouds. They could no longer claim I was too impaired to make decisions about my own life. Their entire argument for forcing me into assisted living had just been professionally debunked. "Mom, even if you're mentally capable, that doesn't change the safety issues," Brenda tried. "What safety issues specifically? I've asked that question multiple times and never gotten a concrete answer." Stephen stood up, pacing to the window. "You live alone. You're 68 years old. You just had a heart attack. Those are facts." "Yes, they are, but none of those facts equals incompetence or inability to live independently." Brenda picked up one of the brochures she'd brought. Dorothy, please just consider Sunset Manor. Even if you don't need assisted living medically, you might enjoy the social aspects. If I wanted more social interaction, I'd join clubs or volunteer more. I wouldn't move to an institution. The word institution hit them like a slap. They'd been using euphemisms like community and assisted living, but I was calling it what it was. It's not an institution, Stephen protested. It's a residential community designed for people your age. People my age who are too impaired to live independently, I clarified, which, according to professional assessment, I am not. We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. Finally, Brenda spoke. So what happens now? Now I continue. Living in my own home, making my own decisions, and managing my own life, I said simply. Just like I was doing before my heart attack. Stephen's frustration finally boiled over. Mom, you're being unrealistic. You can't live here forever. Eventually, you're going to need help. When that time comes, I'll address it. But that time isn't now. How will you know when it is time? Brenda challenged. People with declining cognitive function don't always recognize their limitations. I pulled out Dr. Chen's report and pointed to a specific section. Dr. Chen included recommendations for periodic reassessment. If there are ever legitimate concerns about my competence, we can repeat the evaluation. And in the meantime? Stephen asked. In the meantime, I live my life. The next few weeks brought a subtle but significant shift in household dynamics. Stephen and Brenda continued staying in my guest room, but their constant pressure about moving had been replaced by a different kind of tension. They'd lost their primary argument for controlling my living situation, but they hadn't abandoned their apparent interest in my assets. Instead, they began focusing on helping me with financial management. Mom, I've been thinking, Stephen said one morning over coffee. Since you're determined to stay here, we should at least make sure your finances are organized for any future emergencies. My finances are quite organized, I replied. I've been managing money successfully for decades. I know, but it would give me peace of mind to understand your complete financial picture. You know, just in case something happens and I need to step in temporarily. Brenda nodded supportively. It's just responsible planning, Dorothy. What if you're hospitalized again and someone needs to pay bills or make financial decisions? They were trying a different approach to the same goal, gaining control over my money. This time, instead of claiming I was too incompetent to live alone, they were suggesting I was too disorganized to manage my finances properly. I have all necessary documents in order, I said. Eleanor Patterson has copies of my power of attorney paperwork if there's ever an emergency. Stephen's expression darkened slightly at the mention of my attorney. Mom, I'm your son. I should be the one handling your affairs if something happens, not some lawyer. Eleanor is more than some lawyer. She's been my attorney for 15 years, and she understands my wishes completely. But family should handle family matters, Brenda interjected. It's more personal, more caring than letting lawyers make decisions about your life. I thought about the past month, about their pressure to put me in a nursing home and sell my house, about their dismissal of my doctor's advice and their resistance to professional competency evaluation. That was their idea of personal, caring decision-making. Actually, I prefer having professional representation for important decisions, I said. It removes emotional complications and ensures everything is handled according to my actual wishes, rather than what others think is best. For me. The conversation continued for another hour, with Stephen and Brenda presenting various arguments for why I should give them access to my financial accounts just for emergencies. But I'd learned to recognize manipulation when I saw it, and this was manipulation wrapped in concern. That afternoon, I called Eleanor with an update on the situation. They've moved from questioning your competence to seeking financial control, she observed. That's actually a common progression. When families can't prove incompetence, they often try to gain access to assets through other means. What should I do? Document everything. Keep records of their requests for financial access, their pressure tactics, their continued living in your home after you've established your competence. If this escalates to financial abuse, we'll need evidence of the pattern. Financial abuse? Attempting to gain control of an elderly person's assets through coercion, manipulation, or false claims of necessity. It's more common than people realize, and it often involves family members who feel entitled to early inheritance. The term early inheritance hit me like a revelation. That's exactly what this was: Stephen and Brenda trying to claim my assets, while I was still alive, by convincing me I was too incompetent to manage them myself. Eleanor, I need to ask you something important. If I wanted to change my will, how would that work? Are you considering disinheriting Stephen? I'm considering protecting myself. If he's willing to try forcing me into a nursing home and manipulating me out of my assets now, what happens when I'm actually older and potentially more vulnerable? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Dorothy, that's a very mature perspective. Many people in your situation feel guilty about protecting themselves from family members who are acting inappropriately. I don't feel guilty anymore. I feel angry. Good. Anger is more useful than guilt in situations like this. What kind of changes are you considering? We spent an hour discussing options. I could establish a trust that would protect my assets from manipulation while ensuring my care needs were met appropriately. I could change my will to include provisions that would prevent anyone from inheriting if they attempted to have me declared incompetent without medical justification. I could even disinherit Stephen entirely if his behavior continued. Take some time to think about it, Eleanor advised. These are big decisions, and you want to be sure you're acting from a position of strength rather than anger. But as I hung up the phone and looked around my house that Stephen and Brenda still seemed to consider theirs to dispose of, I wasn't sure anger was such a bad motivator. That evening brought the confrontation I'd been expecting since my competency evaluation had undermined their arguments. Mom, we need to have a serious conversation, Stephen announced over dinner. Brenda set down her fork with the dramatic flair of someone prepared for battle. Dorothy, we've been more than patient with your stubborn refusal to face reality. What reality is that? I asked calmly. The reality that you're 68 years old, living alone in a house that's too big for you, and being unreasonable about accepting help. Stephen leaned forward aggressively. We've tried to be supportive, but you're making it impossible. Either you start being realistic about your situation, or we're going to have to consider other options. What other options? Brenda's mask of concerned daughter-in-law finally slipped completely. Legal options. If you won't protect yourself, someone has to protect you from your own poor judgment. There it was. The threat I'd been expecting. They were going to try to have me declared incompetent through the courts, despite Dr. Chen's professional assessment. Based on what evidence? I asked. Based on your refusal to acknowledge your limitations, Stephen said. Your insistence on living alone after a major cardiac event, your rejection of reasonable safety measures. You mean my refusal to move to a nursing home that my doctor says I don't need, based on a competency evaluation that shows I'm fully capable of making my own decisions? One evaluation doesn't prove anything, Brenda snapped. We could get other opinions. You're welcome to try, I said evenly, but you should know that any court would require much stronger evidence than disagreement with your housing preferences. Stephen's face flushed with anger. This isn't about preferences. This is about your safety and our family's future. Our family's future, I repeated. You mean your financial future. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge neither of them wanted to address directly. How dare you? Brenda said finally. We've been nothing but supportive and caring, and you're treating us like we're trying to rob you. Aren't you? You want me to sell my house and move to an institution so you can access my assets while I'm still alive to see it happen? Stephen stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. That's completely unfair. We want you to be safe and cared for. In a facility that costs $4,000 a month, funded by selling the house I've worked my entire life to own. Where you'd have professional care and wouldn't be a burden on your family, Brenda added. Burden. There was the truth, finally spoken aloud. I wasn't their mother and mother-in-law who deserved respect and autonomy. I was a burden whose continued independence interfered with their plans for my money. I see, I said quietly. So caring for your family is a burden, but inheriting their assets is a responsibility. That's not what I meant, Brenda backtracked, but the damage was done. Stephen moved closer, his voice taking on a threatening tone. Mom, you need to understand that we're not going to stand by and watch you make dangerous decisions out of stubborn pride. What exactly are you threatening to do? Whatever it takes to protect you from yourself. I stood up slowly, drawing myself to my full height. At 68, I might not have been as physically imposing as I once was, but 40 years of managing classrooms full of teenagers had taught me how to project authority. Stephen, I want you and Brenda to pack your things and leave my house. The silence that followed was electric with shock. What? Brenda gasped. You heard me. This is my house. I'm mentally competent to make decisions about who lives here, and I'm deciding that you need to find somewhere else to stay. Stephen's face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, and finally calculation. Mom, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious. You have until tomorrow evening to remove your belongings. You're making a huge mistake, Brenda said, her voice shaking with rage. We're the only family you have. Family doesn't threaten each other with legal action for refusing to give up their independence, I replied. Family doesn't call caring for each other a burden. Family doesn't try to manipulate elderly relatives out of their homes and assets. Stephen stepped closer, his posture aggressive. Where exactly do you think this leaves you? Alone, aging, with no one to help when things go wrong? It leaves me in my own home, making my own decisions with professional help when I need it, and legal protection from people who think they know what's best for me better than I do. You'll regret this, Brenda said coldly. I doubt it. But they didn't leave the next day, or the day after. Instead, they seemed to be settling in more permanently, as if my eviction notice had been a suggestion rather than a demand. When I asked Stephen directly when they planned to find other accommodations, his answer was chilling. Mom, we've decided we can't leave you alone in this condition. It wouldn't be responsible. What condition? Dr. Chen's evaluation showed I'm completely competent. Dr. Chen doesn't live with you, Brenda interjected. We see things she doesn't. See? What things? Confusion, memory problems, poor judgment, Stephen listed. The kind of symptoms that might not show up in a single office visit. I realized with cold clarity what they were doing. They were building a case for having me declared incompetent by documenting evidence of cognitive decline that they were manufacturing themselves. I want you out of my house, I repeated firmly. And we want you to be safe, Stephen replied. Our concern for your well-being takes priority over your temporary housing preferences. Temporary housing preferences. As if my desire to live in my own home was some passing whim rather than a fundamental right. That evening, I made a phone call that would change everything. Eleanor, they're refusing to leave. They're claiming they can't abandon me in my condition, and suggesting they're documenting evidence of cognitive decline. Dorothy, that's very serious. They're essentially holding you hostage in your own home while building a false case for incompetency. We need to act immediately. What can we do? First, I'm going to file for an emergency restraining order based on elder abuse and unlawful detention. Second, we're going to document everything they've said and done. Do you have any recordings or written evidence? I thought about the conversations of the past few weeks, the threats, Brenda calling me a burden, their refusal to leave when asked. No recordings, but I've been keeping notes. Good. Write down everything you can remember with dates and times. We'll need it for court tomorrow. Tomorrow? Dorothy, what they're doing is illegal. You have the right to control who lives in your house, and you have the right to be free from coercion and threats. We're going to enforce those rights. After hanging up with Eleanor, I spent the evening writing down every conversation, every threat, every manipulation attempt I could remember. The pattern was clear and damning. Two people systematically trying to gain control of an elderly woman's life and assets through psychological manipulation and false claims of incompetence. The next morning, Stephen and Brenda were served with legal papers by a sheriff's deputy who arrived at 8 a.m. sharp. What is this? Stephen demanded, reading the restraining order. It's a court order requiring you to vacate this property immediately and prohibiting you from harassing, threatening, or coercing Mrs. Parker regarding her living arrangements or financial affairs, the deputy explained. Brenda's face went white as she read her copy. This is insane. We're her family. We live here. You live here at her discretion, which she has withdrawn, the deputy said professionally. You have 2 hours to gather your belongings and leave the premises. Officer, my mother is not mentally competent to make these decisions, Stephen tried. She's been showing signs of confusion and memory problems since her heart attack. The deputy looked at me assessingly. Mrs. Parker, do you understand what's happening here? Yes, officer. I understand that I have the legal right to control who lives in my house, and I want my son and his wife to leave. Have you been declared incompetent by any court? No. In fact, I recently underwent a competency evaluation by Dr. Rebecca Chen that found me fully capable of making my own decisions. The deputy made notes on his paperwork. Sir, unless you have legal guardianship or power of attorney, your mother has the right to make decisions about her own living situation. She's making dangerous choices, Brenda protested. She shouldn't be living alone at her age. Ma'am, that's her choice to make unless a court determines otherwise. And right now, I have a valid restraining order that requires you to leave. The next 2 hours were a whirlwind of packing, arguments, and threats. Stephen and Brenda moved through my house gathering their belongings while making increasingly desperate appeals to the deputy about my supposed incompetence. Officer, she's been acting confused and paranoid, Brenda insisted as she carried a suitcase to their car. This whole situation is evidence of mental decline. Ma'am, seeking legal protection from family members who are pressuring you to give up your independence doesn't sound confused to me. It sounds smart. As they loaded the last of their belongings, Stephen made one final attempt at manipulation. Mom, when you're lying alone on the floor after a fall, remember that you chose this. You chose pride over family. No, Stephen. I chose autonomy over manipulation. There's a difference. The deputy escorted them off the property and handed me a copy of the restraining order. Mrs. Parker, this order prohibits them from contacting you directly or coming within 500 feet of your property. If they violate it, call us immediately. As their car disappeared down my street, I stood in my doorway breathing the air of freedom, for the first time in weeks. My house felt like mine again, but I knew this wasn't over. Stephen and Brenda would likely challenge the restraining order and continue trying to have me declared incompetent. I needed to be prepared for a legal battle that could determine the rest of my life. Eleanor arrived that afternoon with updates on our legal strategy. The restraining order is temporary, she explained. We have a hearing next week where they can contest it, but based on what we've documented, I'm confident we can make it permanent. What if they try to have me declared incompetent? They can try, but they'll need substantial medical evidence, which they don't have. Dr. Chen's evaluation actually works in our favor. Any court would have to explain why they're ignoring a recent professional assessment. What about my will? Should I change it? Eleanor set her briefcase on my kitchen table. Dorothy, I think we need to have a serious conversation about protecting your estate from future manipulation attempts. We spent the next hour discussing options. A revocable trust that would protect my assets while ensuring my care needs were met. Updated beneficiary designations that included provisions against anyone who tried to have me declared incompetent without proper medical justification. Even the possibility of including a no-contest clause that would disinherit anyone who challenged my mental capacity frivolously. These aren't punishment measures, Eleanor explained. They're protection measures. You're ensuring that your, assets will be used according to your wishes, not manipulated away from you by people who think they know better. Do it, I said firmly. All of it. The hearing the following week was everything I'd expected and more. Stephen and Brenda arrived with their own attorney, a sharp-dressed man who specialized in elder law from the adult children's perspective. Your Honor, their lawyer argued, Mrs. Parker is exhibiting clear signs of paranoia and poor judgment. She's isolated herself from family members who are trying to help her. She's making irrational decisions about her living situation, and she's refusing to acknowledge legitimate safety concerns. Eleanor stood to respond. Your Honor, Mrs. Parker recently underwent a comprehensive competency evaluation by Dr. Rebecca Chen, a neuropsychologist specializing in cognitive assessment. Dr. Chen found no evidence of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. She submitted Dr. Chen's report to the court, along with documentation of everything Stephen and Brenda had said and done over the past month. Furthermore, Your Honor, the respondents have been attempting to coerce Mrs. Parker into selling her home and moving to assisted living against her doctor's advice, and despite her documented competence. They have threatened legal action if she doesn't comply with their demands, and they refuse to leave her property when asked. The judge reviewed the documents carefully, occasionally asking questions about dates and specific incidents. Finally, he looked up at Stephen and Brenda. Do you have any medical evidence that Mrs. Parker is incompetent to make decisions about her own living situation? Their lawyer shuffled through his papers. Your Honor, our clients have observed behaviors that suggest cognitive decline, such as confusion, memory problems, poor judgment in refusing reasonable safety measures. And yet, a professional neuropsychological evaluation found no evidence of these problems. One evaluation doesn't necessarily capture all issues, Your Honor. The judge turned to me. Mrs. Parker, do you understand the nature of these proceedings? Yes, Your Honor. My son and his wife want me to sell my house and move to assisted living. When I refused, they threatened to have me declared incompetent. I sought legal protection because I believe I have the right to make my own decisions about where and how I live. Do you feel capable of living independently? Yes, Your Honor. My doctor cleared me for normal activities. My neuropsychological evaluation found no cognitive problems, and I've been managing my own affairs successfully for decades. The judge made notes, then looked back at Stephen and Brenda. Your concern for your mother's welfare is understandable, but the court cannot override the autonomy of a competent adult based on disagreement with their lifestyle choices. He paused, reviewing the restraining order documents. Mrs. Parker has demonstrated her competence through professional evaluation. She has the right to determine who may live in her home. The temporary restraining order is hereby made permanent. Stephen jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is a mistake. She's going to get hurt living alone, and then it will be too late. Sir, many people live alone successfully at 68 and beyond, unless and until Mrs. Parker is found incompetent by proper legal procedures with appropriate medical evidence. She has the right to make her own choices about her living situation. As we left the courthouse, Stephen made one last attempt at reconciliation, or manipulation. Mom, please. We can work this out. We don't have to be enemies. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who had tried to steal my independence and assets while claiming it was for my own good. Stephen, when you're ready to treat me like a competent adult instead of a burden to be managed, we can talk. Until then, the restraining order stands. You're going to regret this, Brenda hissed. When you're alone and need help, don't come crying to us. I won't, I replied calmly. I'll call the professionals I've hired to help me maintain my independence. You know, the ones who don't think caring for me is a burden. 6 months later, I was thriving. My health had continued to improve. My social life had expanded through volunteer work and community activities, and my home had never felt more like the sanctuary it was meant to be. Stephen and Brenda had made a few attempts to contest the legal decisions, but without medical evidence of incompetence, their challenges had failed. They'd eventually stopped trying, though I heard through mutual friends that they were struggling financially without the inheritance they'd apparently been counting on. Eleanor had helped me establish a comprehensive estate plan that protected my assets while ensuring my care needs would be met appropriately if and when the time came. I'd also updated my will to include substantial donations to elder rights organizations and literacy programs, causes that reflected my values rather than simply enriching people who'd tried to manipulate me. The most satisfying part wasn't the legal victory or the financial protection, though those were important. The most satisfying part was waking up every morning in my own home, making my own decisions, and living my life according to my own values and preferences. At 68, I'd learned that age doesn't automatically equal incompetence, that family doesn't always mean support, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is protect yourself from people who claim to know what's best for you. I'd also learned that too old to live alone was often code for too valuable to be left in control of your own assets. And I'd proven that with the right legal support and professional documentation, competent adults could defend their autonomy against family members who confused concern with control. My house remained mine, my decisions remained mine, and my future remained mine to determine. At 68, I was finally old enough to understand that independence wasn't something you gave up just because other people found it inconvenient. And that was the most valuable lesson of all. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to defend your independence from well-meaning family members? Share your experiences with our community. To listen to another story about family courage and standing up for your rights, click on the video suggestion that appears on your screen. Thank you for listening, and remember, age brings wisdom, not incompetence, and you're never too old to fight for what's rightfully yours.